creating and editing contexts and soundtracks for scenarios and timelines. If you've watched the event creation video, you know that events can have descriptions, text which is displayed when the event is visible and the user clicks on the event. Scenarios and timelines can also have descriptions. There are three differences between event descriptions on one hand and scenario and timeline descriptions on the other. First, scenario and timeline descriptions are displayed only at the start and the end of the scenario or timeline. Second, scenario and timeline descriptions are displayed automatically. The user doesn't have to click on anything. And third, scenario and timeline descriptions can have soundtracks, which are played automatically at the start and or end of the scenario or timeline. Here is a scenario on the boll weevil plague in the United States in the early 20th century and the music that resulted from it. Let's add a starting soundtrack to get the viewer of the scenario in the mood, and let's display the soundtrack information as it's played. To begin with, start by editing the scenario. Since we want this soundtrack to come at the beginning of the scenario, we click on Description for Scenario Start, and then on Show or Choose Soundtrack. This dialog box shows us a couple of things. First, it tells us what the current soundtrack is as stored in the scenario itself. Second, it tells us what is the pending soundtrack selection that will replace the current soundtrack when the user saves the scenario editing session. We can see that there is no current soundtrack and there is no selection pending. Next, we can click on the Choose Source drop-down to choose where is the source of the soundtrack. And we have 6 choices. We can upload a video or audio file from our laptop computer, our local computer. We can select a video on YouTube or Vimeo. We can choose an audio file on the web, or we can opt for no soundtrack at all. Note that choosing a video means that the video soundtrack will be played, but the video itself will not be shown. If you wish to embed a video in the description so you can see it, copy the embed code, and we'll see that in a minute, what that means, provided by YouTube or Vimeo into the description itself, over here. The user, in that case, would have to explicitly play the video. So let's choose a YouTube video. Here's one of Blind Willie McTell singing Boll Weevil in 1940. To use it as a soundtrack, let's scroll below the video and click on the share icon over here. And then click on embed to see the so-called embed code. That's what's highlighted over here. If you want to include this video in the body of the description, not as a soundtrack, you would simply copy and paste this code into the description text area. To use it as a soundtrack, let's copy it and then paste it into the text area brought up by the Choose Soundtrack source selection for YouTube. So let's just paste that. Using a Vimeo video works the same way, except that on Vimeo, you click on a paper airplane in the upper right corner of the video to get at the embed code. Now, notice that History in Motion wants the embed code for the video, not just the URL of the YouTube or Vimeo video. So let's save this. You don't see anything here. Let's go back to this and let's just simply copy the URL of the video. Let's copy that, go back to Show or Choose Soundtrack, and you see we've got nothing currently in the scenario, but we've got a pending soundtrack. So let's choose Video Embed Code, and now let's just put in the URL that we just copied. And if we save that it says, sorry, this is not the embed code, gives us a whole bunch of errors and says, this isn't it. So we're not going to use that at all. And if we just click that again, we see that our good selection, our valid selection is still there. So let's close that. Now, as we just saw here, the pending soundtrack is pending. It's not actually put into the scenario yet. So we can change our minds about that soundtrack several times during the editing session. The other selections are pretty straightforward. For the video or audio file upload, History in Motion will bring up a file selector and choose the appropriate file. If we wanted a URL, it brings up a URL selector. All pretty straightforward. So let's add some soundtrack information here. Let's make it in italics. So let's say soundtrack is Boll Weevil by Blind Willie McTell. And let's close out that. And now let's save that. So I've saved the edit session for the scenario. I can either reopen the scenario, or if I just move from the start of the scenario to a little bit farther away and then move back, there's our description. And there's the soundtrack. Now I'm going to move the time away from the start of the scenario, and the description disappears and the soundtrack ends. There are a couple of things to note. Suppose you have a timeline that starts at the same time as the scenario it's in. And suppose both the timeline and the scenario have opening soundtracks. When you select that timeline, only one of the soundtracks will play. The same is true if the timeline and the scenario both end at the same time and both of them have closing soundtracks. This is by design, since running more than one soundtrack at a time can cause problems in the way some browsers handle the audio. That's not a History in Motion problem, it's a browser issue. Second, as soon as the historical time does not match the time at which the soundtrack is supposed to play, the soundtrack stops, and that's what we just saw a moment ago. When the historical time again matches the soundtrack start time, the soundtrack starts over from the beginning. Third, when you edit a scenario and add or change a soundtrack, you can either reopen the scenario to get the effect of the change, or move away from the start time and then move back to the start time in order to get the opening descriptions soundtrack to play. And last, when you edit a timeline and add or change a soundtrack, you must select that timeline to get the effect of the change. So if the timeline was already selected when you did the edit, you have to select another timeline and then the original one to get the effect of the change. So that's all there is to adding soundtracks to scenarios and timelines. Enjoy.